Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, after nearly 14 years of bloody civil war, the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad has fallen.
The leader who ruled for 24 years had actually left the capital, Damascus.
We'll look at where things stand, where they're headed, and why, in the end, the regime came apart so fast. I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take. On Sunday, December 8th, opposition fighters streamed into the capital city. Soon thereafter, Syrian civilians streamed into the streets in celebration.
Thank God. We're happy because we can go back to Syria. Thank God the war is over. We're so happy about this. This was our life's wish.
It's a feeling of joy after 13 years of pressure and tragedy since we were born. The regime pressured and hurt us, but now we are free, without any fear or oppression, which will be lifted from our hearts.
They were chanting, they were dancing, and they were toppling statues of the deposed leader, Bashar al-Assad, whose tenuous hold on power was maintained with brutal force for years.
My name is Arwa Damon. I am a former CNN senior international correspondent, covered Syria extensively. I'm also the founder and president of the charity INARA that treats war-impacted children medically and in mental health as well. And you are catching me at the Doha Forum in Qatar.
Arwa, there's a lot to unpack, and we will. But first, I wonder if we can try to describe this day on a purely emotional level. You've covered this war extensively. I know you have Syrian roots. How would you try to put into words what we're seeing on these faces? What are people feeling today in Syria?
It's seismic. And what we're seeing, I think a lot of people going through is an emotional roller coaster. There's so much euphoria. There's so much anticipation, but at the same time, there's also a good level of apprehension. We need to remember for a minute what it was that Syria went through over the last 13 years. We need to remember that hundreds of thousands of people were killed, that tens of thousands of people were detained, effectively disappeared into the dark hole that is the Syrian regime's torturous prison systems. Millions of people were displaced forcibly from their homes. And the vast majority of those people thought that they would never be able to go back either to their homeland or to their homes or actually see their loved ones again. And so what I actually have really sort of honed in on is these images that we're seeing of the detainees being released from the prisons and just how, shocked and stunned they are and the thought of their loved ones who are finally going to be able to reunite with them. But at the same time, there is apprehension because even though what happened is extraordinary and it happened so fast, people are also very cognizant of the fact that there's a lot at stake and there's a lot at risk.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so how we got here, the recent events. Just over a week ago, Syrian opposition fighters in the north launched an offensive, and they just started stacking up victories. And by the beginning of the weekend, opposition forces had taken Syria's third largest city of Homs, and suddenly what seemed impossible for years was all but inevitable. The Syrian armed forces started to just melt away, and then obviously the capital was next. So how do you account for this rapid success of the opposition fighters?
Let me caveat everything by saying that when I first heard about the rebel offensive, I was terrified because I'm a very close observer of Syria. But I was fully convinced that the Russians and the Assad regime were going to, exactly like we have seen them do before, bomb civilian targets, go after, the schools and the hospitals. You have to appreciate just how, relentless the targeting of civilians was when the bombing campaigns would happen. And up until this morning, I couldn't quite believe that the end of the Assad regime could come this fast. And seemingly this out of nowhere. Everybody was caught by surprise. And a lot of this, goes down to the fact that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and its leader, Jolani, were quite pragmatic in terms of how they led the military operation, but also in terms of how they prepared for it and then calculated the timing of it. Because you had multiple rebel groups who don't always necessarily get along, but who did manage to create sort of joint operation rooms, which allowed for the simultaneous, targeting of Aleppo and the very critical, M5 highway. And you also had what initially might have seemed like a bad calculation, but actually ended up, given where we are today, being the correct one, of these various rebel fighting groups not stopping where the original operation planned for them to stop and actually going all the way, reading on the ground that Assad's forces were not putting up a fight, that the Russians actually weren't coming to control the skies, and managing to carry this all the way to Damascus.
This could have happened in 2011, right? I mean, the regime nearly fell in the summer, but Assad was bailed out by the Russians with air support, as you mentioned, and by Hezbollah and Iran with ground forces. Is the X factor here that now Russia is just tied up in Ukraine and Hezbollah and Iran are weakened from fighting with Israel? And without that support, the Syrian army was simply too weak to fight on its own?
That's a big part of the X factor. I mean, look, if we look at, 2013, 2014, before the Russians came in to sort of bail out, the Assad regime, the Syrian opposition did control a good chunk of Syria. And what really changed the situation was Russian air power. You control the skies, you're pretty much going to dominate what's happening on the ground. And so, yes, a significant factor in this is that Russia was not willing to or did not have the capacity to sort of re-up its control of the skies. And yes, of course, another big factor is the fact that, Iran is significantly weakened and is not going to sort of use or even has the capacity to use what is left of, Hezbollah or any of its other militias that it backs to bail out the Assad regime. Again, it's almost as if Russia and Iran, read the writing on the wall and said, we can't do this again. But you also need to realize that the way that the operation was carried out, the timing of it, the way that it all unfolded militarily, but also what we're seeing right now in the political space with these repeated statements of the need of, Syrian unification, the need of a smooth transition of power. This is also due to the fact that these various different rebel fighting forces have learned from the mistakes that they made over the last 13 years.
Yeah, so the opposition forces have gotten better, but has the Syrian army gotten worse? Because it seemed like they were very demoralized at the end.
They are demoralized, and they always were demoralized. And, a lot of what, kept people in uniform to a large degree was the fear factor. This is an army that is largely made up of conscripts. They're not necessarily all that well trained. And the Syrian economy in and of itself, is suffering, is struggling. These, foot soldiers in the military are grossly underpaid. The regime did actually a few days ago say that it was going to be, upping the salaries, perhaps one would assume, in an attempt to try to keep people from literally ripping off their uniforms and running away. But we also need to remember that it wasn't necessarily the Syrian army that was keeping Bashar in power. It was Russia and Iran that were keeping Bashar in power. The Syrian armed forces never really, had to fight. Not in a way that would have been or would be required to sort of maintain territorial control over Syria.
What's next for Syria? That's after the break. So let's talk little winners and losers. Obviously, the big loser is Assad himself. I mean, talk about whiplash, right? I mean, a year ago, he's welcomed back into the Arab League. He's touring foreign capitals. And in over a week, it's over. I know it's early, but how do you think this regime will be remembered?
Most certainly for its brutality, for its willingness to massacre and obliterate its own civilians. We need to appreciate the sort of depth and breadth of the fear that Bashar al-Assad and also his father invoked in the people. I remember on numerous occasions, wanting to speak to Syrians outside of Syria, Syrians who had already fled, who were very hesitant to talk on the record because they still had family members inside. Because even if you were on the outside, you were potentially putting your family inside at risk. You were putting your friends inside at risk. You were putting anyone who was remotely affiliated with you at risk. The fear of the regime, the fear of disappearing into these prisons and these detention facilities because of the torture that happened there, permeated every single fiber of everyone's being. That's how strong of a sort of regime of fear was carried out for decades in Syria. Decades.
Yeah. Wow. What about Assad himself? I mean, he was a man who never was supposed to become the leader, and then he ends up ruling for almost 25 years in this brutal, vicious way. What about his legacy?
I mean, it most certainly is going to be very, very dark. Very dark. And, I remember being in Syria, actually, on a family vacation, right as Bashar was coming into power. And there was this sort of sense of, he's young, he's hip, he has this, he's Western educated, he has this, beautiful wife who's also Western educated. And there was this sense of, almost false optimism that perhaps he would be different than his father. And some would say that in the beginning he tried to rule differently, but then, his father's henchmen, even his mother got into his ear, and eventually, the son became the father. And the son became even more brutal than his father ever was.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the victors now. The main opposition group, as you mentioned, HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, they have this charismatic and savvy leader, Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, and he's kind of saying the right things. He's talking about national unity. He's talking about being inclusive.
Today, we are not talking about individual rule and whims. We are talking about a system of institutions. The governance structure in Syria deserves to be an institution of governance, not a single ruler monopolizing decision-making.
Is HTS going to be in control of whatever government comes next?
So that is a big fear, because we need to remember also that HTS has been designated a terrorist organization. But Jilani's very pragmatic. I mean, look, it's well known, well documented that Jilani was a part of al-Qaeda in Iraq. And he was then, after al-Qaeda in Iraq was defeated, jailed in Syria when he went back home, and then released by, the Assad regime, the Nusra Front. But the thing to remember is that Jilani had learned from the lessons of al-Qaeda in Iraq when he formed the Nusra Front. But they still made some mistakes. They took over, a lot of mistakes. They took over, a huge chunk of Aleppo. And so over the course of the years, as, there was this morphing of what it was that Jilani wanted his identity and, his group to be, a lot of the lessons of the mistakes of Iraq, the mistakes of Aleppo, and even now today, quite possibly the mistakes of how they were ruling in Idlib are something that he himself appears to be taking into consideration and calculation. And so the rhetoric we are hearing definitely is exactly what needs to be said, but that's not to say it's going to actually be that easy to implement. HTS is going to have a role in the future of Syria. They very much are sort of the heroes of the story right now. They led all of this, they planned all of this. But it's going to be that big question of, is their role what Jilani says it's going to be, or is it what everyone fears it's going to be?
Okay, let's talk practicalities in the very present tense. The opposition ordered strict protections on public institutions and services. I guess the goal here is at least trying to avoid what happened in Baghdad after the U.S. invasion, where government offices were looted. I mean, they're like stripping copper wire, and so in the very near term, who will be running the country?
Well, so for now, it does seem as if, until there's some sort of individual who can actually step in and lead something of an interim government, there is this attempt to keep as much of the current, civilian governance structure in place to try to ensure that some of these, basic services, do continue, that, civil servants are able to work, that streets get cleaned, that there's water, that sewage gets cleaned up. But this is what's going to be very, very tricky right now is, Jolani's just shown up in Damascus. The rebels that took over Damascus are from the south, not necessarily his group, and weren't part of his original operation. There's going to be a lot of politicking that these groups are not necessarily well versed in. But there is also a recognition, I think this is quite important, that after having lost so much, there is an understanding that compromise is going to have to be made unless people are ready and willing to lose even more.
Which global players do you think will be most active in trying to influence what this new government looks like?
Well, Turkey definitely is going to have and is going to want to have a big seat at the table. The Russians are going to want to at least, try to maintain their control over the port and their military bases because, Syria basically is sort of Russia's military footprint in the Middle East. Iran is going to, it looks like Iran is very much out of the Syria game right now.
Yeah, it does.
The United States and Israel are going to want to try to influence things. Europe is going to want to try to influence things. And I think, the Western world might grossly underestimate the depth of the bitterness among Syrians towards them. Because remember, Syrians went out calling for what is often termed Western values. They wanted democracy. They wanted freedom. They wanted a say in their future. And the West abandoned them. And America especially allowed its red lines to be crossed over and over and over again. And so the U.S. and the Western world might want a seat at the table, but that might not be viewed as something that Syrians themselves would necessarily welcome.
Yeah. What about these reports of Israeli tanks crossing the border?
Yeah, into the Jolan area and reaching this city called Quneitra. Israel, the logic behind that is that Israel is going to want to, land grab and expand a buffer zone. Because one of the reasons why the U.S. didn't really throw its weight behind Syria's revolution and then its rebels from the beginning. The CIA had a couple of, pretty pathetic training projects, and, the State Department and the Department of Defense had its groups here and there that it was backing, but it was all very window dressing. And the main reason why we didn't necessarily see the U.S. really throwing its full weight behind the voices calling for freedom and democracy is because there was this notion out there that, at the very least, Assad keeps the border with Israel stable and secure, and there hadn't been any real cross-border incidents. So now that safeguard is gone, Israel is going to want to go in and expand its territory and try to potentially set up a buffer zone.
Yeah, a lot of these neighbors are probably kind of two minds about what's going on. Like, say, Turkey, for example, right? They have concerns about the Kurds, obviously, but there's also hundreds of thousands of refugees that can now go home, which might make things easier domestically. The refugee issue is really going to be something to monitor, isn't it?
Yeah, and look, people want to go home. Everybody wants to go home. And so if we're going to talk about, how does Turkey resolve its refugee issue, how, does Europe even, resolve its refugee issue? Let's not forget that there are tens of thousands of refugees along, sort of the Europe route that were just frozen in place, that are still living in camps there. But even people who, settled into countries that are outside of Syria, I mean, everybody wants to go home. And so the deciding factor is really going to be, what kind of a home do they have to return to?
As we wrap up, Arwa, the war in Syria has lasted so long that I think, regrettably, many people just sort of tuned out from the coverage. And I want to make sure that our interest in what's ahead doesn't cause us to forget those who we lost along the way. And I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. I wonder if there's a specific story or a person that you've met during your reporting that you're thinking about today as we're watching history unfold before us.
There's a lot of people I'm thinking about, but as you were asking the question, there was one sort of face that came to the fore. And he was a young man, 23, 24 years old. He was called Dr. Ibrahim, but he wasn't really a doctor. He was still a medical student. And I met him in Damascus in 2011 when I basically snuck away from the government minders and went to cover a demonstration. And he had started up and this was before there were medical field clinics, and he had started up basically one of the first, makeshift underground field clinics to treat wounded demonstrators. He was part of a network that was called the Damascus Doctors. And I met him at this demonstration. And he had such a big heart, and he had so much hope back then. And I remember going with him, and I met, a boy. He was like 13, 14 years old in a wheelchair. And Dr. Ibrahim was like beside himself because he hadn't been able to save this little boy from being paralyzed. But I mean, how was he ever going to? And I met a couple of other people that he had tried to treat from, gunshot wounds and all sorts of things. And I remember he told me that when the regime fell, he was going to buy a Harley Davidson and ride it all over Syria. And I remember he would talk about how every single night and day he would say goodbye to his mother. And he never really knew if he was going to see her again. And he was killed less than a year after I met him. He had taken the decision to flee. And he was stopped at a checkpoint and shot and killed. And I remember I was in Baghdad at the time, and I saw the images coming out on Jazeera and not wanting to believe it in that moment. But then his brother called me and told me that it was true.
Well, Arwa, thank you so much for coming on The Take.
Thank you for having me.
And that's The Take. We're always listening to what you think of the show, so let us know what kind of episodes you'd like to hear and what you thought of this episode. We do read the comments, so go ahead and put your thoughts below. We'll check them out.